All right, everybody, welcome back to another flipped lesson here for anatomy and physiology, where we're going through the skeletal system. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about the actual bones of the body. So in our last flipped lesson, we looked at the microscopic level, we looked at the function of the skeletal system, we looked at the inside of bones. So today we're going to do a brief overview of many, not all, but many of the bones in the human body. All right, and first thing to talk about here is types of joints, right? And a joint, as we've talked about, is where two bones meet, all right, or where they articulate and able to meet and move off one another. Okay, and we have three types of joints here. We have non-movable, which are known as synarthrotic joints, all right, and an example of non-movable joint or immovable would be the bones of the skull, right? You can see here on the skull, these different bones, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, are all fused together. They can't move. Okay, then we have ampiarthrotic joints, which are slightly movable. And these are the bones of the vertebrae. So we can see each of the vertebrae moving down from the cervical here down to thoracic. They're able to move on each other, which is why we can move our neck and back and twist, right? But they're not super movable. All right, they can only move a certain amount. Then we have diarthrotic, which are movable joints. And these are those freely movable joints which have high range of motion. Our knees, elbow, wrist, shoulder, all those ones that we can really move a lot. So those are our three types of joints that we're going to see. And again, a joint is any place where two bones meet. So some of these freely movable joints, right, which we call synovial joints, because there's synovial fluid, which we talked about with connective tissues, right, in those joints. A couple different types here. So we have the ball and socket, right, which we see in the shoulder here, where the humerus comes into the shoulder girdle, and we see the head of the femur comes into the pelvis here. And those are really, really easily freely movable because it's basically a ball that sits in a little hole, right? And you have kind of 360-degree motion. Then we have hinge joints like your elbow and knee, which kind of close like the hinge on a door. We have pivot joints, all right, on your lower arm here, which allow you to move your wrists, right, like over, okay? Pronate and supinate, we call that, right? We can move our wrists over each other. So that's what really gives your arm some great motion. You have the freely movable joint, the ball and socket of your shoulder. Then you can hinge your elbow. And then here we can turn our hands over with that pivot joint. All right, then we have this called a saddle joint, right? Which is where your thumb comes into your wrist here. And you can see all the bones of our wrist where our thumb sits on there. Pretty cool. So those are types of our synovial joints or our freely movable joints. All right, let's look at some of these immovable ones, right? The bones of the skull. And definitely you're going to want to know these. And as we go through all these slides, right, you're going to want to know these. So I would definitely suggest maybe taking a screenshot of them so you have them. Otherwise, you could always come back to the video and reference it. All right, but moving through from 1 through 9 here. So these are important bones of our skull, right? We think of our skull as one solid bone, but there's a bunch of them in there. And we know we talked about last lesson and in class about bone development and how they grow from when we're kids. So we know that when you're in the womb, when you come out as a little kid, these aren't fully fused yet. So they are individual bones, right? We have our frontal on the front, our parietal comes on top, our temporal on the side here in the yellow number 3. When you think about your temple, you've heard that before. Your occipital, all right, is all the way in the back here, where it controls your movement back there. We think about our brain. The sphenoid is this little guy in here, all right? The ethmoid bone in the middle behind your nose. The maxilla up here on the front of our face. The mandible, right, is down here, our jaw. And we have the zygomatic bone up over here by our orbital or eye socket. Cool stuff. So make sure you know those. So we have another cool one in here called the sphenoid bone, all right, which is way deep in there. And it's pretty cool because it looks like a butterfly, all right? And you can kind of see here like 2 eyes, wings, leg, and that's the Latin name for butterfly. All right, so the sphenoid bone, pretty cool. All right, moving along here, we got another one in the middle called the vomer bone, and very thin, right in there below the nasal cavity, which comes down over to the roof of your mouth. All right, so we have this term called sutures, right, which is where two bones meet. And the sutures where the bones meet, right, is especially when they're fused. All right, when you become an adult and then they're all hard. There's no more cartilage in there, and we got a different couple different types of sutures we'll talk about. So we have the coronal, right, which is between the frontal and the parietal. So think about crown, right? Coronal, like you're wearing a crown. The lamboidal, which is between the occipital and the parietal. So that's back here. The squamosal, which is between the temporal and the parietal. All right, and then the sagittal, which is between the parietal bones. And the sagittal comes up top here. I think we got a better view of it, right? If this is the top of your head, this is the sagittal suture, right down the top of the head. And again, a suture is where any connection between large bones, like in skulls, all right? Now, when before they're hardened, right, when you're a fetus or especially even a young baby, a newborn, right, you have some gaps between those bones, and those are called where there are fontanelles, right? So a fissure is any wide gap. So we have the fontanelles here, right, and the fissures are before these sutures are fused up, and you can really see, right? I know we talk about right, how a baby's skull, you gotta be very careful of the baby's head because it's all cartilage. You can see, well, it's hard bone here, right? Here's a sagittal suture. Here's the posterior towards the back. Anterior, you have these large fontanelles, these big spaces where there's just cartilage. There's no hard bone yet. Pretty cool. All right, and again, those are the soft spots. So we see the fontanelles. Nice. We see all the different bones of the skull, which we've already mentioned. All right. Another big word that we need to know here is called foramen. All right. So a foramen refers to any type of hole. Okay. And especially in the skull, we have actually lots of openings in the skull because there's lots of nerves and blood vessels that leave here. Because again, that's such an important part of our body where our brain is in here. So one that you definitely have to know, right, is the foramen magnum. So that magnum, if you think way back to I think probably even our first lesson in anatomy, we talked about Latin roots and different prefixes, right? Magnum means big, and we already said foramen means hole. So the foramen magnum is the big hole of the skull, and you can see it's right at the bottom here. And yeah, that's where your vertebrae connect to your skull over here, right? Your C1, your atlas. And what runs through the foramen magnum? Your spinal cord, right? Your medulla oblongata comes down, merges into the spinal cord, which runs down your entire spine. And when we look at skulls in class, right, you'll see we actually have lots of little holes here. Like this is the mental foramen at the front of the mandible down here. So lots of little skulls here where all sorts of things, neurons, blood supply come in and out. Cool. And again, we could see the foramen magnum at the bottom. Nice. Cool. So a process, right? Let's talk about processes here. Is anything that kind of sticks out to the side. So we mentioned we had the zygomatic bone over here. So the zygomatic process are these spaces that actually come out to the side here. And I like this inferior view, right? Looking up from the bottom, you can see how it's kind of this thin piece here. And you have this big hole over here, right? Another foramen, okay? And really important because it's a pretty easy thing to break, right? You break your cheekbone on the side. Cool. So this is something you're going to, or actually, let's go through this one more time, right? So we got the frontal, all right? We got our nasal bones over here. The sphenoid, we talked about, the little guy on the side. And again, this is an anterior view, so it's going to look a little different from the first picture we looked at. Okay, we have our lacrimal bone, which is in here, kind of where our tear duct is. All right, the zygomatic bone on the side we just talked about. The vomer way inside deep in the middle of your nose there by the septum. The maxilla, the top part of your jaw. Right, the coronal suture up at the top there. Think about the crown. All right, your parietal bone in the back, temporal bone on the side, the mandible on the lower. Sweet. And we got some more here. Here's that coronal suture, the frontal bone, again, nasal bone, sphenoid, maxilla, mandible, the parietal, the squamous suture, right down the side, lamboidal suture, the occipital bone, temporal bone, mastoid process, okay, in here. And the zygomatic, right, where that zygomatic arch comes through to our temporal bone. Nice. Sweet. All right. So again, one more screenshot if you want to take, but we kind of went through all these. So again, if you missed any of those, go back, take a screenshot, look, and definitely need to know the bones of our skull and our sutures. Sweet. So let's talk about the rest of our bones here. And again, we're not going to name every bone in the body, but we're going to kind of go through the big ones because we have yet to really do that as we start to talk about the skeletal system. And then we can talk about how these bones work together. So again, staying with our axial skeleton, right? We talked about the skull. Let's talk about the vertebrae or the vertebral column. Oops, sorry. Right, so we have all these bones of our vertebrae, which we said are slightly movable joints. They're not fused together, but they don't have full rotation, right? We can't twist 360 degrees around, which would be pretty cool, but we can't do that. All right, so four major parts here. Well, three major parts, then we'll talk about these guys at the bottom. You have the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic, which are in your chest, and then the lumbar, which are like your lower back. All right, so the cervical make up your neck. There's 7 of them. The thoracic ones, your ribs attached to, they protect our chest, our lungs, our heart, our lumbar, our lower back. Really, really big, right, for lots of support. Whereas these guys are a little bit smaller here, so we have good movement of our neck. Okay, a great way to remember how many bones are in each. Think about breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And maybe this is not for you guys, but maybe for your Grammy or Grampy, right? What time do they eat breakfast? 7. What time do they eat lunch? 12. What time do they eat dinner? 5 o'clock. Early bird special. Cool. So then we have the last two, the sacrum and the coccyx down here, right? So the sacrum is actually where all these below L5 here, right? All these are fused together, okay? And it's kind of like a fused part that attaches to our pelvis there. And then you have your coccyx, right, which is the tailbone that sticks out at the bottom. All right, sticking with our axilla, right, and we're talking about the rib cage. So we have a number, 12 pairs of ribs, and we can see them here on the front of the chest. Okay, we call the first 7 our true ribs, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. They actually connect right to our sternum with cartilage. Okay, so that's kind of why they're called the true ribs. Then we have these, the next 3, 8, 9, and 10 are called the false ribs, right? And they're false because they're actually not directly connected to the cartilage, to the sternum, but they do have cartilage that connects all the way up here. Then we have 2 pairs of floating ribs, right? And if you look at the skeleton, you'll actually see that, 11 and 12 way down here have these little tiny ribs that jut out, but they're not connected to anything, okay? And those are your floating ribs, we call them, the last 2 pairs. Something else to know here, I have this little notch at the bottom called the xiphoid process, so that's a good one to know. And if you feel your chest and you feel down to your sternum, you'll feel like a little divot. Okay, that's where the xiphoid process sits. Cool. So moving our way to our appendicular skeleton, right? To our pectoral girdle, our shoulder girdle. We got a bunch of bones here that make up our shoulder and hold it all together. So we'll start moving off the sternum since we just talked about that. We have the clavicle or the collarbone here, all right, which is this one that comes across. You could feel it on the front of your chest. Very pronounced, very easy to break. In the back, we have our scapula, which is our shoulder blade. And then we have our humerus, right, which comes down to our arm. So one of these joints that we need to know is called our acromioclavicular joint, all right? And that comes from the clavicular, clavicle. And then you have the acromion, right, which is this part of the scapula that comes up. Where those two join make the AC, or the acromioclavicular joint. So if you ever heard of an AC separation, that's what that is. All right. Working our way down here, bones of the arm. So we have the humerus. We get to our elbow, and then we have 2, the radius and the ulna. All right. So ulna goes to the pinky. I like this one. PU, right? PU, pinky, ulna. All right. On the thumb side of your arm is where your radius is. So think about your thumb, and that's where we take a radial pulse. All right, and then we have the bones of the wrist, right? So we call the wrist our carpal bones, right? And there's 8 small bones. I'm probably not going to quiz you on them, but just so you could reference them here. So you have your carpals, then you have your metacarpals, right? The bones of your hand, which stretch out really far. And then you have your phalanges, your fingers, right? Which are these ones down here. And I'm sure we've all broken those before. Not fun. All right, so a little trick here that to learn the carpals, some lemurs try peanuts they can't handle. Again, I'm probably not going to ask you the carpal bones, the wrist bones. So again, that would be these ones down here, though. Then you have the hand bones, and then the phalanges, right, come off that. Cool. Moving our way down to the legs, right? Let's talk about the pelvic girdle. So we see some different parts here. So here's that sacrum we talked about, right, which is, you could see here like L5, lumbar number 5 would sit right on top. So the sacrum, these are all fused together as one bone, and they connect to your pelvis right here. And then you have your coccyx way down here of the tailbone, all right? So your pelvic girdle, your hip bones, right, are these big, giant, they're huge. There's lots of blood supply that run through them. Really, really important. And like we'll talk about in class this week, you can actually use this to tell the difference between a male and a female skeleton. All right, so we have our coxal bones here we need to know. I'm just going to work down these from the side again. The sacrum, all right. The pubic tubercle, which is where the pubic bone is, or the pubis, right, where they connect here. We call this the pubic arch, right in the middle, where the 2 sides of the pelvis come together. Your pubis, right, is lower down here. All right, pubis symphysis, sorry, where it comes together. Then we have this other big open space, right? One of my favorite anatomical words called the acetabulum. All right, so definitely know that one since it's my favorite word. The acetabulum, right, is this big hole here in the pelvis, and that's where your head of the femur sits. And we talked about, right, your leg, your femur, and hip bone were freely movable joints, right? A ball and socket joint. And you can see it's definitely a socket, and that ball fits in there. All right, so, and again, the sacrum is between the two coxal bones here. All right, and the coccyx is the tailbone that comes below. So definitely know some of these terms. Take a screenshot if you want. All right, moving down our leg, our femur, right, our longest bone in the body. And you can see the head of the femur up here. And we've looked at pictures of these before where it goes into the acetabulum of the pelvis. All right, you work your way down, you have a kneecap bone, right, the patella, which sits right on the top here. Kind of easy to become dislocated, believe it or not. Then you have two lower leg bones, right? The tibia is in front, way bigger. Then you have your fibula behind, right, which is kind of a tinier, more curved bone. And then just like how in our hands we have the carpals, metacarpals, phalanges, right? The wrist, hand, and fingers. Down low we have the tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. All right, so the ankle bones, the foot bones, and the toes. All right, and I always think, how do you not confuse carpal and tarsal? Think about the alphabet, right? C is above T. So C is up by your hands, T is down by your feet. Again, so looking at these ankle bones here, again, really cool. I'm not going to probably quiz you on these. Maybe two of the big ones, and I'll tell you those in a second. All right. But if you're a podiatrist, foot doctor, you definitely got to know these. So you have your ankle and upper foot. All right. So those tarsals. So one that you definitely need to know is the calcaneus. All right. That's your heel bone in the back. And it's really important because you can see it's the biggest bone in your ankle and foot complex down here. And really important because, right, we talked about the Achilles tendon that connects to our gastrocnemius, our calf muscle we talked about. That attaches down here. All right. So that attaches there. And then the other one here is probably your talus, right, up here where your tibia sits on front or on top of. Okay, and that's really how your leg connects to your ankle. So those are two you need to know: your calcaneus, your talus. The other one's probably not going to ask you, but we have the tarsals, metatarsals, phalanges. Beautiful. And again, some more diagrams here if you want to know. And hey guys, that was quick. I know it was a quick recap of some of those, or introduction to some of those big bones, right? But definitely wants to know. So make sure you go back, take screenshots if you have to. Be prepared to know those. And then this week we're going to look at our cats and see how some of these bones compare. All right, shoot me an email if you have any questions, and see you on the next one.